Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to episode 19 of Opening Basics. In this video we're going to take a look at the bishop's opening. So that's e4, e5, bishop c4. To put this in a little bit of context, we've been looking at different replies that white has, different moves that white has after e4, e5. Now the main move by far is knight f3, so what we've actually been looking at is moves other than knight f3, and this will complete that little series. So the previous videos have covered f4, the King's Gambit, accepted and declined, or d4, the center game and Danish Gambit, or knight to c3, the Vienna game, and now with bishop to c4 that completes all of the replies, all of white's second moves, or all the main ones after e4, e5, other than knight f3. And in the next video we will start looking at knight f3 lines. But bishop c4, like knight c3, it's not bothering to attack this pawn. The other moves, knight f3, f4, and d4, all attack this weak e-pawn. What knight to c3 does is it stays out of the way of the f-pawn, so we have f4 as an idea later, and it defends the e-pawn. Whereas the move bishop c4, it doesn't defend this pawn, it doesn't attack this pawn, but it does stay out of the way of the f-pawn, and it sets up some aggressive ideas against f7. So this move, the bishop c4 move, is actually one of the older chess openings. It was written about back in the 17th century and it's played quite a lot back then. So there's a lot of tactical lines in this variation. And it's an interesting way to play. It's not played so much anymore, but it's not like it gives away the advantage. White still keeps some slight opening advantage. It's just that, the top level players have all decided that going with knight f3 here is the best way for white to press for an edge, but it's not like it's a bad move. And because it has a lot of tactical possibilities and some different ideas in it, it may be useful as a surprise weapon. So the main move from black is knight f6, a very logical move, just attacking this pawn and developing a piece. And so white needs to decide what he wants to do about that. If he plays knight to c3, this is actually just transposing black back into the Vienna game. And we looked at this position in the previous video even. This is a position from which we can get into the Frankenstein-Dracula variation if knight takes pawn is played. Pretty interesting line. I talked about that extensively in the previous video. So I'm not going to cover the knight c3 line. d3 here, just defending with the pawn, is actually the main way of playing. And we will get back to that. But first I wanted to talk about the Gambit ideas in this position. There's a few of them. First of all, you always have to check f4, because one of the ideas with the bishop move is to get into a version of the King's Gambit that is favorable, or at least different than what you might get. So if black takes the pawn, in fact this is a line from the bishop's Gambit, which is the line of the King's Gambit where the bishop comes to c4. And you've also avoided certain lines. So for example, the queen h4 check line is not available here. So this is okay. If you like playing the bishop's gambit, this is a way to get into the bishop's gambit and avoid certain lines that black has. So and white is okay here. He's got some compensation for the pawn, maybe not quite enough, but interesting play. If we back up, black, however, doesn't have to take the pawn. So he can play knight takes e4, which is a bit risky. That leads to some wilder tactics. A bit safer way to play is probably this move d5, which common idea in these openings, these old double e-pawn openings. You need to open up a line for your light squared bishop. You want to counterattack some of the pressure from this bishop, and it might continue with e takes d5, and then you can play knight takes d5. And this is okay for black. Black can hold this position. So, I guess I'll show a few more moves. There's different tries white has, but it's important to note that the queen f3 doesn't work. So queen f3, you can actually just grab the pawn, and if you try and chase the knight away to, get this mating attack going on f7, then I can drop back to e6. So that doesn't work. White actually plays in this position. Queen e2 is a move, or knight f3. Going after the e-pawn. So that is a line you can play, but with an edge to black. So in this position, after bishop c4 and knight f6, the main gambit idea is not f4. There's actually two ideas here. There's the Boden-Kieseritzky gambit with knight f3. This is an interesting gambit. And It's just counterattacking, attacking this pawn and leaving this pawn hanging. Now, if you go knight c6, we have actually transposed directly into the two knights defense of the Italian game. So you can play this as you would normally play a two knights defense with knight g5 or d3, whichever your preference is there. But if black tries to keep it independent and take advantage of the gambit, he can grab the pawn, and you get pretty good compensation for the pawn here. The interesting idea is knight c3. You want to, instead of just grabbing this loose pawn here, what you want to do is you want to counterattack and harass black's only developed piece. And he can take, and then you get this open position. I mean, black has secured his pawn edge. He's going to hold on to his extra pawn. But you've got wide open lines for your bishops, and you've got two pieces developed. And this pawn is a bit hard to defend. It's under attack. And it can't be, this is another important point, it can't be defended with d6 because knight g5 in this situation is just a killer. So a very typical tactic in the bishop's opening. You get the knight quickly to g5, and with that exchange of the d-pawn, we've opened up the support. This bishop supports the knight on g5. So black is in big trouble here. So actually black needs to play a move like f6, defending the pawn and keeping the knight out of this square. And so you've got compensation for the pawn here. You've inflicted an awkward pawn structure on your opponent. You've got easy lines for your pieces. So interesting gambit play for white. That's the Boden-Kieseritzky gambit. And another gambit with similar ideas. After knight f6, you can play the move d4. Now d4 right away is known as the Yanni gambit, or the move d4 by itself. But after a couple moves, the main line goes e takes, d4, knight f3, just developing and maybe with the idea of rounding this up. Also, notice it's leaving this pawn hanging. And then if knight c6, we've transposed into actually a line in the Italian game once again, the two knights defense, where white can continue with e5, which would be the Max Lang attack or castle. And this is an interesting way for white to play. To stay away from the Italian game lines, black can take the pawn, and this is the Urusov gambit proper here. And there's another line where black will keep the pawn, but white has interesting compensation. He develops, he's got the queen out, he's got two pieces developed. This knight needs to move. It can't easily be supported here, so it drops back to f6. That's the best move. And white can continue developing with bishop g5. So it looks at first glance like a tremendous lead in development and maybe more than a pawn's worth, but keep in mind that black has counterattacking ideas with the knight coming to c6. So it turns out to be roughly balanced, and white has compensation for the pawn, but interesting way to play. So those are the gambit ideas in this position. And one of the things that makes the bishop's opening attractive is it does have all these gambit ideas. So let's go back. Bishop c4, that's the bishop's opening. Knight f6, the main reply. So the number one move, though, the top move for white, is just the quiet move d3. And the idea is not necessarily to transpose into the Italian game, but also to still keep in mind the idea of playing the move f4, this time with the bishop supporting it, so the bishop can take back right away. So black can continue knight c6, playing it like a two knights defense, and white can try f4 right away here. It's probably not so good right in this position. I think this is a position where black has the move d5 as a reply, and after white takes, yeah, he can take back here, knight takes d5, and get an okay position. So f4 is not the main idea right here. Black is going to keep this in reserve for a while. And, of course, he can play knight to f3, go directly into the Italian game, or I can keep it in the Vienna game, or a bishop's opening, by playing knight to c3. And this is also a line you can get from the Vienna game. So here, the main move for black is to develop the bishop to c5 or to b4. If you play bishop to c5, a pretty logical move. At this point now, f4 becomes an interesting idea. And if you take, this is one of the key ideas, is bishop can come out here directly. And what black is going for in this position is he's got this dark squared bishop, which is controlling the G1 square here, which prevents white from castling. So say black just continues developing, knight here. White would really like to castle in this position, but it's going to take him a little more maneuvering to get to it. But if he does manage to get castled, he's got an interesting attack going. He's got the open F file, we'll have the rook here, and so it'll just take a bit of work to get there. Interesting way to play. Let's see. Instead of taking back right away, white can also develop the knight first. And he does have to watch out for this knight g4 idea. This is a tricky line with the knight threatening to come in here. And now he's sort of forced to capture on f4 and bishop to f2 check. So a dangerous way to play. But this turns out to be okay for white. So the king can go to e2. He's momentarily discomfited, but he's going to get a rook on f1, and he'll have an interesting play here. Actually, slight edge to white in this position. So anyway, an example of the kinds of tricky positions you can get into. So for black, it may be the safest thing to do to try and transpose into one of these King's Gambit positions. Let's see, after f4, is there a way to decline it? Yeah, black can decline the gambit with d6, maybe a little safer to do that. And we have a... Again, white is going to have to do something about the bishop. Maybe the move knight a4 will be a move. The move knight a4 will be an idea at some point to chase this bishop off the diagonal to allow castling, or queen e2 and bishop to e3, trying to stop it in this fashion. But that's a bit slow. Anyway, interesting positions arise, and different than what you might get from other openings. So worthwhile checking out. Okay, let's back up. That was actually the main move of black here, but black has a couple other replies. So after bishop c4, instead of going knight f6 and allowing all those funny gambits and tactics, black can try and keep it a bit quiet by playing the move knight c6. So this clamps down on the move d4, so that eliminates one source of tactics. And if white tries f4 in this position, black can continue developing with bishop to c5 and get a decent position here. It's important to notice that it's not possible to take the e-pawn right now because of queen h5 check is just winning for black. So white needs to spend another move with knight f3, and now black can get in the move d6. And we get a similar kind of position as to what we saw at the end of the previous section. This is pretty safe for black and about even. He still has this nice bishop on this diagonal, which is annoying white and preventing him from castling. White in this position also can try and build up slowly with c3 and d4 and try and block the bishop that way and build up a bigger center. But white also has some interesting ideas in this position because as long as the f-pawn is here, when the d-pawn moves out of the way, the bishop will be able to come to f4 in a single move, and he can always take on e5 at some point. White can take on e5 at some point after he's castled and open up the f-file. So interesting lines here. Let's back up. There is a third reply that black has to the bishop c4. After bishop c4, black can also reply bishop c5. This is known as the classical variation, just setting up a symmetrical position here. And now if white goes knight f3, this actually can transpose directly back into the Italian game. So with this move. And at this point, white can build up with c3, have all the usual options in the Italian that we have in the Italian game, including the Evans Gambit there with b4. So the other thing he can do here is play knight c3. That's probably the main move to keep it out of lines, keep it from immediately transposing. Although this is a line of the Vienna game, and this is a fairly quiet opening at this point. Not a whole lot going on. knight f6 can be played. Maybe that's the main response, and then typically I will respond with d3. We'll get this kind of quiet setup here, although f4 is still the move that's in reserve at this point. Knight c6, f4 can be played here, and this is a position we actually looked at a bit earlier. So we just transposed back into another line. If black plays with knight c6 instead of knight f6, just knight f3, and yeah, we're just going to transpose again d3, getting into a similar position. Although when you develop the knight to f3, you're blocking the f-pawn and you're killing a lot of ideas. So most of these lines transpose into fairly quiet lines in the Italian game, but there is one independent gambit here, which is known as the Wing Gambit, and you can try it out. It's the move b4, kicking the bishop, and it bears a lot of similarity to the Evans Gambit. You take, and you can play c3, bishop drops back, and then you can push on with d4 or develop your knight to f3 and get an interesting game here. Knight f6 and d4 for the gambit. So it's similar to the Evans Gambit. You have compensation for the pawn, and interesting kind of play. In fact, actually, we may have transposed into a position from the Evans Gambit directly after throwing in this knight f6 move. So anyway, those are some of the ideas with the bishop's opening. I wanted to mention there was one other reply that black here has after bishop c5. Not especially good, but I did play this in one blitz game, and that's the Calabrese counter gambit. So you can throw the pawn up to f5, sort of like you're playing a reverse king's gambit. And if white goes in for knight f3, you get one of these wild lines similar to what you get. Actually, it's identical to a position from the Latvian gambit. The Latvian gambit is knight f3 first, then f4, and then bishop to c5. So I'll talk about that a little in when I get to knight f3 lines. Now white here doesn't have to play like that. After the move f5, he can safely defend his pawn with d3 and still keep a decent advantage here. This just creates weaknesses for the black king side, and doesn't really gain a whole lot. So, but it is an interesting line that you might see, and you do have to be aware if you go into for some of these tactical lines that it can get pretty complicated. Okay, well that wraps up my coverage of the bishop's opening. As I said, in the following videos I'll be taking a look at lines starting with knight f3 after e4, e5, knight f3. I've already looked at a couple of knight f6 lines, the Italian game and the Spanish game in the Chess Basics series, so I won't cover those again, but I'll start out by looking at other replies other than knight c6 to knight f3. So stay tuned for that. I'll see you then. Bye.